Hi everyone, my name is Sanitma. I was in the national team in 2022 and 2023, and right now I'm one of the coaches at the development squad. So today I'll be doing a debrief video for you guys on an economics motion regarding the IMF. So basically, as you know, the IMF is currently providing Sri Lanka with economic assistance in terms of loans. And when the government receives these loans, there are certain conditions by which the government has to abide by. So this debate is basically about which of those conditions are good and which of those conditions are bad for the Sri Lankan economy. So the Infoslide has a lot of jargon and it's attached in the description box as well. But basically the breakdown on this debate is, on proposition, you have to support a world where the government receives these loans and the only condition it has to abide by are anti-corruption provisions. On opposition, in addition to anti-corruption provisions, you also need to support things like 1. Privatizing state-owned enterprises, 2. Reducing or eliminating subsidies for things like fuel, electricity, water and fertilizer, and 3. Having market-based interest rates, and finally having floating exchange rates. Okay, so I'm going to divide this debrief into a couple of sections. First, we're going to talk about the incentives of IMF. Secondly, we're going to talk about the incentives of local governments. Thirdly, we're going to characterize what each of these policies are and the lines of argumentation you can run on proposition and opposition. Okay, so first in terms of IMF incentives. On proposition, the strategy is, firstly, you have to characterize this organization is an organization that cannot necessarily relate with the living conditions of Sri Lankan people. You could say that the conditions of IMF loans are determined by privileged economies of the West who have no idea about the lives of Sri Lankan people, who have basically been living where a majority of people end up living in very impoverished conditions for their entire lives. So that is why these economies end up prioritizing things like inflation rates or long-term paying back debt over things like the immediate real-world harms that occur to these people, like them losing their jobs or prices of goods increasing and them not being able to continue with their daily livelihoods. So for example, you can use this policy example where the IMF supports things like free trade over protectionism usually. And the thing about protectionism is that for countries like Sri Lanka, protectionism is the only thing that ensures that local businesses are able to run. So if you let foreign companies come into the country and don't regulate their prices, they can easily cause local businesses to be bankrupt because of the differences in resources and money and things like that. And the second thing you can say here is that the IMF is an organization that is funded by the West, right? So these Western countries have their own interests as well. They might want their companies to come into Sri Lanka and have employment opportunities and things like that. Or they might want to engage in things like resource extraction. So what you need to say is that the IMF as an organization doesn't necessarily have the best interests of the Sri Lankan people at heart all the time, which is why only following things like anti-corruption provisions will probably be more beneficial. On opposition, on the other hand, you have to characterize the IMF as a very effective organization. So firstly, you can say that the IMF cares about their loans being paid back, right? Because obviously the IMF doesn't have endless cash. The only way in which it can remain as an organization that lends money continuously to countries that need economic assistance is if these countries to whom they lend their money end up paying back these loans, which is the only way in which they can function. The second thing is the credibility of IMF as an organization. Let's say that the IMF has really bad policies in Sri Lanka that end up creating drastic economic harms to our country, then it obviously affects the credibility of the IMF as an organization, which means that more developing countries might end up moving to hostile actors like China, and the intuitive harms of that. And the third thing you can say is that the IMF policies aren't as overly westernized and skewed as the proposition wants to characterize, because historically when the IMF did these policies in countries like Ghana, which is a place where this really Western policies didn't end up working out, the IMF was criticized for that. And because of such experiences, you could say that the IMF has more of an incentive to use those lessons and actually implement policies that are more suitable for the unique economic environment of Sri Lanka, because even these economies are not stupid. They can understand the unique circumstances of developing countries' economies over others. So you can run that line of analysis. So the second section here is the incentives of local governments. Now, I feel in this debate, both sides will end up conceding that austerity measures are politically unpopular. So austerity measures are basically when you cut down on things like subsidies for various fertilizer, electricity, water, and things like fuel, which causes the prices of all of these goods to increase. So what you need to say on proposition is that, number one, the government would not introduce massive austerity cuts, and that's good for intuitive reasons. This is the strongest arguments on prop. So stuff like job loss won't occur, and people will be able to afford the basic goods that allow them to live their lives. However, I feel like in politics debates, you don't need to fall into the trap of saying like governments are only short-termist all the time, because even in Sri Lanka, these political parties do care about the long term somewhat, because they want their political parties to be dominant for like a longer time. And the other thing is like, even in situations like the Aragale, like some of the reasons why all that economic turmoil occurred was because of like the short term policies of politicians, right? So they wouldn't want like more public uprisings, and they wouldn't want like the economy to crash in the long term as well. So you could argue that the like government won't introduce like really stupid policies that will end up creating massive harms. So don't like fall into that trap of like only saying that the government is like uniquely short-termist on proposition as well. On opposition, however, you need to push that characterization of like governments being short-termist, and then say that the people in Sri Lanka constantly want things like subsidies. Like even recently, you had like electricity bills and things like that being subsidized, and even then people were like constantly asking for more and more subsidies as well. So now the issue with subsidies is that once you opt into providing subsidies, it's very difficult for you to opt out. So because like it's like politically unpopular for you to do that. And the other thing is like, when you're providing subsidies, many like government organizations are going to be running at a huge loss, which is like bad for their efficiency and bad in the long term. And the other thing about subsidies is that in order for you to like provide subsidies, you either need to like cut spending from other areas, or you need to like get money somehow, right? So you either end up printing money that will lead to inflation, because now the supply of your currency increases in the economy, leading to like the value of your currency reducing, leading to inflation, which like reverses all of those impacts in terms of things like subsidies, because if the prices of all of these things increase, then like, you know, some cuts in terms of their prices won't even like have a huge impact, and it can end up like affecting people's savings and making all that money pointless as well when you create things like inflation. So that is the line of argumentation you have to have on opposition. Okay, now the final section in this debrief is where we talk about each of these policies and break them down. So firstly, let's talk about austerity measures. Now on proposition, you have to like contextualize the fact that a large percentage of Sri Lankan people are living in impoverished conditions. So number one, when they don't have fertilizer, because like many of these individuals depend on agriculture for like their livelihoods, they will have less yield, and that means they won't have enough food, they won't be able to invest in their children's education, and it creates like the poverty cycle all along. And secondly, things like water, it directly end up like affecting your health and well-being. And when it comes to things like fuel, it affects like small businesses, because they won't be able to function, and then small businesses will have to like cut down on things like jobs, creating loss of employment. And there are like a huge amount of impacts you can run from this argument on proposition. And this is bad because of a couple of reasons. One, these are like the fundamental human rights of people. And two, you can characterize that like more people end up being pushed to poverty on the opposition's word. Because if you end up like earning less income from agriculture, or you won't be able to support your small businesses, these people can end up going bankrupt, or they might end up like being forced to take more loans or something like that. And in turn, like more people end up being pushed to poverty, which is like worse for the long term as well. And the other thing is like, right now, there were like a couple of natural disasters which ended up like affecting people's agricultural crops and all of that. So anyway, there's like a massive urgency for the government to like provide things like fertilizer subsidies in Sri Lanka right now. So if you don't provide these things, then the recovery of these individuals who were affected drastically is also like really impossible. And the other thing is like, prices of commodities are already anyway high because of the war in Ukraine, because of like the inflation that occurred after COVID-19. So anyway, this is going to like be entirely horrible for like the Sri Lankan people's livelihoods. And here you have to do a bit of weighing and say that because all of the long-term benefits that opposition is talking about are uncertain and abstract, we need to like prioritize these short-term immediate harms, and it's immoral for the government to like not care about these harms on opposition. Okay, so the line of argumentation you have to run on the other side on opposition's world is that the government basically doesn't have the capacity to like provide things like subsidies right now, because it's already in like a massive amount of debt, for instance. So like I explained the impacts of inflation earlier. And the other thing you can say is that the IMF probably wouldn't like cut down like all of subsidies and have like massive austerity cuts, for instance, because you can run that analysis about why the IMF will likely be a bit more realistic. And the other thing is, you need to care about like repaying debt and stuff like that, because the government like right now has huge amounts of debt and the interest rates are increasing. And if you are able to like maintain a government surplus and make sure that these governmental organizations are not running at a loss, then that means your chances of like repaying this debt and like fixing your economy in the long term is much higher. So you can like look into like the economy of Greece, for example, which is a good case study for opposition, because Greece is an economy that's experiencing those long-term benefits of IMF policies right now. And you can run some analysis on foreign direct investment on opposition, I feel like, because the IMF is like a credible institution within the point of view of investors. And when you know that the IMF, which is like a credible institution, is directly overseeing how Sri Lanka is maintaining their government spending, they are more likely to come into the country because they feel like the conditions of Sri Lanka are going to be stable. But if you know that the government is in sole control of spending, you are like going to worry about the government, having too much of subsidies, it leading to inflation, and basically the conditions of Sri Lanka's economy being very unstable. So FDI is less likely to come in. So you can run like an FDI argument and talk about how that helps in terms of like generating more employment opportunities and better growth for like the Sri Lankan people as well. Okay, so the other thing we have to talk about are state-owned enterprises. Now, the issue with state-owned enterprises and the problem you run on opposition is that these state-owned enterprises are used as political tools where politicians, in order to get votes, end up giving like a lot of people jobs under these organizations, and some of these people are underqualified, causing these institutions to be really inefficient. So Sri Lankan Airlines, I feel like, is the best example here. It's like an organization that has been running at a loss for like a long time. So if private organizations are if like private companies end up controlling these things, since they're driven by profit, they are likely to like convert these organizations to become far more efficient and prevent like them running at huge like millions of dollars of losses, and like terrible, which is like terrible for like the economic which is like terrible for the economy in the long term. And I feel like on opposition, maybe you can support like an alternative where you invest more on things like education, or like focus on things like vocational training, because the main argument that proposition is going to run here when it comes to like state-owned enterprises is job loss. So maybe you can support things like vocational training and investing more in education, because these are not like things that the IMF conditions require you to follow. On proposition, there's like the intuitive analysis on job loss, and all the impacts we discussed earlier apply to it as well. The other thing you can say here is that this job loss is a bit irreversible, because since businesses find like that fertilizer or electricity and water and like all these basic goods that are necessary for them to function are also expensive, then businesses also find it hard to like create new jobs, and the private sector is also finding it hard to like create new jobs. So this job loss is going to be like irreversible, causing like unemployment rates to increase, and like all the impacts we talked about earlier apply as well. Okay, so the next policy we're going to talk about are things like exchange rates. So when it comes to exchange rates, there are mainly like two ways in which exchange rates are determined. One is floating your currency, two is pegging your currency. So floating your currency is basically like allowing the value of your currency to be like determined by market forces. So let's say that many countries end up purchasing a lot of like US imports. So because the demand for US dollar increases, then that will cause the value of the US dollar to increase. But let's say that there are like certain countries with like really bad economic conditions, there's a lot of inflation, their GDP is not good, so that will cause their currency value to like decrease. So basically, depending on the nature of your economy and depending on things like market forces, and like simply put like the supply and demand for like a certain currency, that is how floating your currency ends up like determining the exchange rate. But there's also like another way in which you can go about it, which is called pegging your currency. So pegging your currency basically means like if China pegs their yuan to the US dollar, that means that within a certain range, the exchange rates of the yuan and dollar is going to be fixed. So now the reason a country would do this is because, number one, let's say that you're like a very small country and your exchange rates end up like varying a lot. And let's say that you depend on things like US imports a lot for like the functionality of your government. So then it might be beneficial for you to like peg your currency to like the US dollar, because the US dollar is comparatively much more stable than your own currency. But for a country like China, the reason they do it is because they are a more export-oriented economy. So when China pegs their currency, what they do is they artificially manipulate the currency in such a way that the Chinese yuan's value is going to be like very low compared to the US dollar. So this would mean that for like people in the US and for like other countries, buying Chinese exports will be very cheap. So that increases the amount of like Chinese exports that are being sold, overall leading to like a better economy in China. So I feel like Sri Lanka is like a bit of a diverse economy because we do depend on imports, and right now we have been like increasing imports for certain essential goods, but then we do also have like exports like tea, and we have our tourism industry, so you can like use the analysis depending on how you want. But there is argumentation you can run on proposition where like, because some countries don't like it when you end up pegging your currency, because for some countries that engage in like trade relationships with you, it's like very disadvantageous. It's like very disadvantageous for you, right? Because like, let's say the country A is trading with country B. So if country B is always able to artificially manipulate their currency, then country B will always end up like selling more exports than the other way around, because they can like always artificially manipulate their currency in such a way that their exports end up being cheaper for like other people. So when it comes to things like trade relationships, it might be more beneficial to float your currency, because many, like a majority of nations, that is what they do, and it's not like disadvantageous for any actor. But then there's like the other side of being able to like implement suitable measures and making your currency more stable. Okay, so the final thing we had to talk about is in terms of implementing market-based interest rates. So here what it means is, now let's say that Sri Lanka is battling things like inflation. So if the government is battling things like inflation, then the suitable policy would be to increase the interest of things like loans, because that means people are inclined to borrow less, because if they borrow when the interest rates are really high, then it's like hard for them to pay it back and they'll end up being bankrupt and things like that. So therefore, that reduces the amount of money circulating in the economy, and this can lead to like inflation reducing. But let's say that you want to like increase the GDP. If you want to increase the GDP, you need to increase public spending. Then it might be beneficial for you to reduce things like interest rates on loans, which means that people end up borrowing more money and they are able to like spend more, they're able to start their businesses and stuff like that. So increasing interest rates might be politically unpopular, because then people won't be able to like function in their businesses and things like that. However, like implementing suitable interest rates to fit your economy is what ensures economic recovery from things like inflation, which is like better overall for the economic feasibility of Sri Lanka as a whole. So that's about it for this motion, guys. Thank you so much for listening. Bye.